The day after the soaked rabbit incident, Mark walked Sophie to the edge of their small yard. She pointed at the fence line. "That's where she was last night," she said, her voice soft but certain. Mark glanced toward Karen's house. Her blinds were drawn, her porch empty, but there was something deliberate about how still it all seemed, like a trap pretending to be a neighborhood. That evening, Emily suggested they attend the next HOA meeting. "Maybe if we show up and speak directly, they'll back off." Mark didn't want to believe this place could be malicious. He'd grown up with nosy neighbors, sure, but this was supposed to be better, safer. When they entered the meeting hall, it felt like stepping into an old courtroom. Orderly chairs, a podium, and a crowd already in place. Karen stood at the front, dressed in a gray blouse, a silver pin, shaped like an eagle on her collar. "New residents joining us," she announced without looking up. "Please review past violation reports before submitting personal concerns." Mark raised his hand. "Actually, I'd like to talk about something serious." Karen motioned for silence, and the room went still. He explained about the rabbit, the visits, the video footage. "I'm not accusing anyone," he said carefully, "but it's hard to ignore a pattern, especially when my daughter, 5 years old, is scared to play outside." Karen's smile didn't crack. "Security concerns are taken seriously," she said, "but unless you can demonstrate a direct threat with verified evidence, I suggest focusing on compliance." Emily stepped forward. "Are you saying a child's safety isn't enough reason to investigate?" A man in the crowd coughed. Another adjusted his seat and looked away. No one stood with them. The meeting ended 10 minutes later. On their way out, a quiet voice behind them whispered, "She never lets it go when she picks a target." Mark turned, but the speaker had already disappeared into the cars outside. Back home, they tried to return to normal. Sophie seemed okay during the day, but she no longer sang while coloring. Her chalk sat untouched for the rest of the week. Then came the next blow. A letter arrived certified. It read, "This is your final warning. Continued disturbances from your household will result in formal disciplinary proceedings and potential legal mediation. This includes excessive noise, repeated unregistered items on community grounds, and antagonizing HOA leadership." It was signed not just by Karen but the full board. Emily stared at the letter, stunned. "They're building a case against us." Mark nodded slowly, fury rising behind his eyes. "They're trying to scare us into silence." But silence wasn't an option anymore. That night, Mark rewired all their exterior cameras, positioning one near the side of the house where Karen always lingered. He installed a second system on the inside, near Sophie's window, and backed everything up to a cloud drive. He didn't tell anyone, not even Emily. The next morning, the new camera caught something chilling. At 4:03 a.m., Karen appeared on the footage again. This time, she didn't just linger, she leaned close to the side of the house and pressed something small against the siding. Then she turned and walked away. Mark paused the footage, zoomed in, the object, a silver screw with a plastic tag tied to it. He stepped outside to investigate. Where she had been, he found a small metal plate, barely the size of a coin, screwed into the wall behind the trash bins. On it, carved in neat block letters, were 3 words, "Silence the noise." And that's when Mark realized this wasn't about rules anymore. This was personal. Mark sat on the porch with the metal plate balanced in his palm. Silence the noise. 3 words that no longer felt metaphorical. Emily stood behind him, holding her phone but not using it, staring past their front yard like she was trying to find something hidden in plain sight. "I want to go back," she said quietly. "We just got here. We didn't come here to be hunted." Inside, Sophie played with her dolls in complete silence. She hadn't asked for the chalk in days. Her world had been vibrant, full of giggles and squeaky wheels. Now it was muffled. Mark slid the metal plate into a small lockbox and stored it beneath the floorboard in the master bedroom closet. He wasn't sure what to do with it yet, but he wasn't letting it disappear. 2 nights later, another alert. Same time, just past 4 a.m., Karen appeared again. This time, she wasn't alone. Another figure stood with her, a man with broad shoulders, glancing around nervously. Mark couldn't make out his face, but the two spoke for almost a full minute. Then Karen handed him something wrapped in cloth, and the man walked off into the dark. Mark rewound the footage a dozen times. Whatever passed between them wasn't casual. At breakfast, Emily tried to keep things light. "Do you want blueberry pancakes?" she asked Sophie. The little girl looked up, hopeful, until a loud knock rattled the front door. A new letter, this one hand-delivered by a different HOA member. Unregistered surveillance equipment must be disclosed and approved by the HOA Security Committee. Failure to comply may result in escalation. Mark barely had time to digest the words before he saw it. Someone had installed a small black inspection sticker on the side of their camera mount. "They touched our cameras," Emily whispered. "No," Mark said. "They marked them, so they know what to disable later." The family stopped sleeping fully at night. Emily moved a chair into Sophie's room. Mark stayed downstairs. The silence in the neighborhood was no longer peaceful. It was a drumbeat of dread. Every distant footstep, every motion sensor alert, every flickering porch light, it all felt like it meant something. Then, something changed. Mark got a call from a number with no caller ID, A man's voice. Raspy and low. "You don't know what she's done before," he said. "You should leave while you can. Some of us tried. One moved. One didn't get the chance." Before Mark could speak, the line went dead. That night, Mark reviewed public records. Most of the neighborhood had been there for years, but one name stood out. A woman named Cynthia Harper. She had lived 2 houses down from Karen, and disappeared 3 years ago. Her property had gone into foreclosure. No forwarding address. No trace. The records showed she'd filed a formal complaint against the HOA 3 months before vanishing. Mark dug deeper, found an archived version of the HOA newsletter. One photo caught his eye: Karen handing Cynthia a warning letter, with a smug smile frozen in time. Emily watched over his shoulder. "What if it wasn't just harassment?" she asked. "What if this is her pattern?" The doorbell rang again. Another letter. This one simply read, "Final notice. Defiance has consequences." Mark looked up at the camera lens above the porch. Karen was watching. He wanted her to see his face, because he had just made a decision. He was no longer going to react. He was going to investigate, and if what he suspected was true, the plate on the siding might just be the first clue in a much darker plan. 2 days passed without incident. No knocks, no letters, no midnight alerts. The silence should have been a relief, but it wasn't. It felt like the part in a storm when the wind stops howling, right before it tears the roof off. Mark had started taking notes in a black leather notebook, 1 page for every incident. The plate, the warnings, the man in the video, Cynthia Harper. He even mapped the location of every home that had filed HOA complaints over the last 5 years. Most had mysteriously vacated the neighborhood within months of their report. At the center of the pattern was Karen Bellmore. Mark hadn't shared everything with Emily yet. He wasn't ready. But the pieces weren't falling randomly anymore. They were orbiting something. That night, Mark stayed up reviewing security footage. At 3:22 a.m., he caught something. A figure, tall and limping slightly, walked past the side fence and into the backyard. The figure didn't stop or look around. He moved like he belonged there. Then Mark saw it. The same man who had met Karen earlier that week. He was wearing a maintenance vest. Only there was no maintenance scheduled. The man walked to the back of the house, knelt under the kitchen window, and pressed something against the siding, then left in silence. Mark rushed. Outside, the air was thick still, like the yard itself was holding its breath. Beneath the window, near the crawl space vent, he saw it. Another plate. This one was larger, etched deeper, and read, "Noise control zone. Enforcement active." He ripped it off and took it inside. It smelled faintly of gasoline. Emily stood in the hallway, rubbing sleep from her eyes. Another one. Same message, but this one's wired, Mark said, turning it over. Inside the casing was a tiny transmitter. He recognized it: Lorraine's short burst frequency, often used to sync devices, not for monitoring. For activating. Emily stared at him, her face pale. Activating what? Mark didn't answer. He didn't want to yet. The next day, Mark visited the local records office while Emily took Sophie to her parents. He dug into the HOA's formation documents, the signatures, the charter. That's when he found something that didn't belong. Original application listed an alias. Karen Elizabeth Frey. The name tugged at something. He searched public court databases, arrest records, civil complaints, and then he found it. Karen Frey had been part of a lawsuit in another state. The charge: psychological harassment and unlawful surveillance in a private housing community. The case had been dropped after the plaintiff disappeared. The details were sealed. The case never made the news. Mark printed everything. He returned home as the sun set, the wind still. Emily was waiting on the porch. "Something's wrong," she said, gripping her phone. Sophie's teacher called. Someone from the neighborhood requested access to her school record, said it was for verification, used a fake company name, but the school didn't report it until I asked. Mark's grip tightened on the steering wheel. "She's escalating." He stepped inside and pulled open the lockbox. 2 metal plates, a printed HOA violation, the charter, the lawsuit. He arranged them all on the table. Then he picked up the camera footage and replayed the moment Karen passed, the man, that wrapped object. He paused the frame, zoomed in. It wasn't cloth. It was a padded gun case. Everything inside. Mark wanted to deny it, but the image burned through every doubt. This wasn't about chalk drawings or toys on the lawn. Karen wasn't just enforcing rules. She was preparing something. And Sophie, somehow, was in the center of it. The following morning, Mark locked the new transmitter plate in a toolbox and drove it straight to a friend, Tony, a former electronics specialist who now ran a repair shop downtown. Tony turned the piece over slowly, eyebrow raised. "Where'd you get this?" he asked. "I need to know what it's meant to trigger. Fast." Tony promised a call within the day. Mark didn't wait around. He headed back to Maple Hollow, unease crawling up his spine like ice under skin. Emily met him at the porch. She was here again, she said. Her voice trembled, not from fear, but rage. She stood on the sidewalk just staring. No clipboard, no letter, just her. And Sophie was on the swing. Mark didn't answer. He walked inside, reviewed the footage, and found the moment. Karen stood with her arms folded, eyes fixed on Sophie. She didn't move, not even when Sophie looked up and waved. Dot just watched. He pressed pause, then came a knock. This time, it wasn't a letter. It was Officer Janes from the local precinct. Mid-30s, uniformed, guarded but polite. "We got a call," he said. "About aggressive surveillance? Someone complained that you're using recording equipment to harass neighbors." Mark stared at him. "Aggressive surveillance. It's standard to follow up. Mind if I see the footage?" Mark showed him a few clips. Karen trespassing, the man with the transmitter, the plate under the kitchen window. Officer Janes watched, quietly, no notepad, no expression. After a minute, he asked, "Have you filed any formal complaints?" "Dozens." The officer nodded. "I'll log it." He gave a slow, tired sigh. "But there's not much we can do unless someone gets hurt." That sentence hung in the air long after he left. Late that night, Tony finally called. "I don't know what you're caught up in," he said, "but that thing isn't for sinking. It's for jamming." Jamming, short-range signal, disruption, blocks, surveillance, cameras, alarms only temporarily, but enough time to do something, then leave before anyone knows. Mark lowered the phone, his blood running cold. The man under the kitchen window hadn't just planted a signal plate. He'd disabled the house's defenses while he did it, and they had no idea what else he might have done. Mark got up and did a full sweep. Nothing broken, nothing stolen, but near the crawl space entrance he found small scratches on the wood. Not made by weather, not made by an animal. Marks left by metal. Maybe a tool, maybe a blade. He turned on every light in the house. Then he stood over Sophie's bed, watching her sleep. The same thought played over and over. She was the target, but why? The next day brought no more letters, no more knocks, no movement on the cameras. The quiet returned, until Sophie picked up her chalk again. For the first time in weeks, she stepped outside and started to draw flowers. Clouds, a little pink rabbit. Mark and Emily stayed near. Maybe they thought the act of coloring again would mean things were healing, and for a moment, it almost felt like it. Then Karen appeared. She didn't speak. She didn't scowl. She simply stood behind the fence, watching through the slats. Sophie looked up, confused. Why is the staring lady smiling now? Before Mark could answer, he saw it. Karen was smiling, not politely, not bitterly, but like someone who already knew what was coming next. That night, the front doorbell rang. Mark opened the door. Slowly, no letter, just a single bullet casing on the welcome mat, and the words "Stay quiet" scratched into the metal. Mark stared at the bullet casing lying cold and still on the welcome mat, its dull brass surface catching the faint porch light. A chill ran through him, not just because of the object itself, but because of the message it carried. Stay quiet. 3 words etched not only on metal, but burned into the fragile safety he'd tried to build for his family. Emily stepped beside him, her hand trembling slightly. Sophie peeked from behind the kitchen doorway, clutching her stuffed bunny clothes. Mark's mind raced. This wasn't random. This was escalation. He picked up the casing carefully with a gloved hand, placed it inside a Ziploc bag, and headed to the police station. At the precinct, he handed the evidence to Officer Janes, who took it with a grave nod. "We'll open an investigation," Janes promised, though his eyes betrayed exhaustion. "But you know how these cases go." Mark knew, too well. Threats masked as warnings. Evidence disappearing. Neighbors staying silent. But this time, it was personal. His daughter was the target. Back home, Mark began barricading the doors and windows with extra locks and sensors. He set timers on lights to mimic presence. Cameras were everywhere, some hidden, some obvious, part of a strategy to show Karen and anyone else watching that they were prepared. Days passed in a tense silence. Sophie still refused to go outside. Emily barely slept. Mark barely ate. The neighborhood looked peaceful, but Mark could feel the storm brewing just beneath the surface. Then, one evening, the HOA sent an official statement. It arrived in an unmarked envelope, thick and crisp. "We regret the recent events and advise all residents to maintain calm. The board will be holding an emergency meeting to discuss community safety." Mark stared at the letter. The board? The same group that had ignored their complaints? The same group that had stood silently as Karen circled their home like a predator? He made up his mind. He would attend the meeting and he wouldn't be alone. At the hall, Mark noticed faces he hadn't seen before. People with wary eyes, heads down, shoulders tense. Some whispered as he passed. Karen stood at the podium, immaculate and calm. "We understand the concerns about recent incidents," she began smoothly, "but the community must abide by the rules. Safety is everyone's responsibility." Mark stood, his voice clear but steady. "You've failed us. You've ignored harassment and threats against a child in this neighborhood. Where is the protection? Where is the justice?" Murmurs rose among the crowd. Karen's smile tightened before she could answer. The door swung open. 2 deputies entered carrying a large box. Karen's eyes flicked briefly to it, then away. Mark's lawyer stepped forward. "We have evidence of Karen Bellmore's involvement in illegal activities, including falsification of HOA documents and threats against residents. We demand her immediate suspension pending a full investigation." The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Karen's confident facade cracked ever so slightly. Then the unexpected happened. A neighbor, quiet and reserved until now, raised her hand. I lived next door to Karen before I moved. I want to share what she did to my family. One by one, others stepped forward, stories of intimidation, vandalism, disappearances. The room filled with voices no longer willing to stay silent. Karen stood frozen, her authority dissolving into the weight of truth. Outside, a storm rumbled in the distance. Mark glanced at Sophie, sitting beside Emily, her small hands tightly clasped. They weren't safe yet, but for the first time, they had a chance. The storm outside rattled the windows of the community hall, but inside, something more powerful was breaking loose, the silence that had strangled Maple Hollow Estates was beginning to shatter. Mark felt the room shift as neighbors recounted their stories, one after another. A mother whose mailbox had been set aflame, a retired veteran whose garden was trampled underfoot, the family that suddenly disappeared without a trace, all tied by the same thread. Karen Bellmore's iron grip on the neighborhood. Karen stood at the podium, pale but defiant. Her voice trembled as she insisted, "I have always acted in the community's best interest. These accusations are baseless." But the faces around her said otherwise. The weight of truth crushed the lies. Mark's lawyer handed over more trove of emails, secretly obtained, showing Karen coaching neighbors on how to file false complaints, suppress dissent, and manipulate HOA board votes. Then the most damning piece of all, a confidential letter from Karen's past, obtained through a whistleblower, revealing her plan to silence disruptive elements at any cost. Mark's heart pounded. This wasn't just a grudge or petty neighborhood squabble. This was a campaign of intimidation and worse, a premeditated threat against his family. As the meeting adjourned, the HOA president was officially suspended pending a full investigation. Police officers and legal representatives promised swift action, but Mark knew the real battle was just beginning. Back home, Sophie was still recovering from the trauma. The bullet casing, the late-night threats, they had left scars no one could see. Emily sat beside her daughter's bed, humming softly, trying to soothe the shadows lingering in Sophie's eyes. Mark reviewed the footage once more. One clip stood out: Karen standing outside Sophie's window, holding a handgun. Not brandished or fired, but the presence alone was enough. It was the evidence they needed to push for justice. Days later, the police returned with a search warrant. Karen's house was raided. Inside, officers found unregistered firearms, forged documents, and disturbing journals outlining her fixation on controlling the neighborhood through fear. Karen was arrested, but the damage extended beyond one person. The HOA itself was implicated, its board members, accused of complicity through silence and inaction. Mark's lawyer prepared civil suits on behalf of affected families, demanding restitution and reform debt. Amid the legal battles, Mark discovered something unexpected. Hidden beneath Karen's house was a locked safe, containing old photographs and letters. Among them was a faded picture of a young girl, no older than Sophie, with sad eyes and a fragile smile. Mark's lawyer uncovered records showing Karen had lost custody of her own daughter years ago, under suspicious circumstances. It became clear the obsession, the cruelty, the threats, they were all tied to a broken past and twisted grief. But for Mark and Emily, the past mattered less than the future. They vowed to rebuild Maple Hollow Estates not as a place ruled by fear, but as a community healed by truth. And as Sophie's laughter slowly returned to the front yard, Mark knew the fight for justice was far from over. With Karen in custody, and the HOA board under intense scrutiny, Maple Hollow Estates seemed poised for a fresh start. But Mark understood better than anyone that power rarely surrenders quietly. As legal battles waged on, Mark began to dig deep, just into Karen's past, but into the entire HOA's web of influence. He discovered a hidden truth. The HOA was more than a neighborhood committee. It was a tightly knit network with ties to local officials, businesses, and law enforcement. Invisible grip on the town itself. This revelation shifted the stakes entirely. The obstacles they faced were no longer just personal vendettas. They were systemic. Mark reached out to a trusted journalist contact from his past, a hard-nosed investigative reporter named Lisa. With her help, Mark compiled the evidence, footage, and testimonies into a comprehensive dossier. Together, they began exposing the web of corruption controlling Maple Hollow Estates. In parallel, Mark used his civil suits settlement funds to buy Karen's foreclosed house. But instead of letting it stand as a symbol of fear, he transformed it. With help from neighbors, it became a community center, a safe space for children and families who had suffered in silence. Emily spearheaded a campaign for stricter HOA transparency laws and mandatory community safety oversight. Their story gained traction on social media, sparking a nationwide conversation about HOA abuses and the dangers of unchecked power in suburban enclaves. Meanwhile, Sophie flourished in the new environment. The community center became her second home, a place where laughter returned and fear dissipated. One afternoon, as Mark walked the renovated halls, a surprise visitor appeared. It was Officer Janes. "I want to apologize," he said quietly. "I didn't see the full picture at first, but your persistence forced us all to look harder." Mark nodded. "It wasn't just me, it was the community, and it still is." Then came the final twist, something no one expected. Lisa's investigation uncovered a startling secret. Mark himself was an undercover journalist, assigned months earlier to infiltrate and expose corrupt HOA systems nationwide. His move to Maple Hollow Estates wasn't accidental. It was part of a larger mission. Mark had kept his identity hidden to protect his family and gather unfiltered evidence. The revelation stunned the community. But for Mark, it was about more than just reporting. It was about making real change. As the video camera panned out from the busy community center, Mark addressed the audience directly. This story isn't just about Maple Hollow Estates. It's about every place where power goes unchecked and people suffer in silence. If you're watching, and you or someone you know is trapped in a situation like this, don't stay quiet. Reach out, fight back. We can change the system. The crowd behind him cheered, a symbol of hope rising from the shadows. The courtroom was packed. Cameras flashed, murmurs rippled, and the tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Mark stood, steady, watching as Karen Bellmore took the stand, her gaze cold, defiant, but undeniably shaken. The trial had become more than a legal battle. It was a reckoning. The stories from neighbors, the evidence unearthed by Mark's investigation, the secrets from Karen's past had all converged here. Sophie sat beside Emily, clutching her mother's hand tightly. She was no longer the frightened child who once hid indoors, but a brave little girl ready to face the truth. The prosecution presented the surveillance footage, the forged documents, the bullet casing with the chilling message. Karen's lawyers scrambled to dismantle each piece of evidence, but the jury's eyes rarely left the screen. When it was Sophie's turn to testify, Mark had recorded her statement in advance, her soft, clear voice describing the fear and confusion, but also the courage that kept her going. The courtroom fell silent. After hours of deliberation, the jury returned with a unanimous verdict: guilty. Karen Bellmore was sentenced to prison for assault with a deadly weapon, intimidation, and obstruction of justice. But the story didn't end there. Outside the courthouse, Mark held a press conference. His words were measured but fierce. This verdict is a victory not just for Sophie, but for every family silenced by fear and abuse of power. However, the battle to reform HOAs nationwide continues. We must ensure no other family suffers like we did. And then, the final twist. Mark revealed to the gathered crowd that he had been working undercover for months before moving into Maple Hollow Estates. His goal was to expose systemic abuses in HOAs across the country. Maple Hollow was his toughest assignment yet. The revelation shocked many but also inspired hope. Proof that courage and truth could topple even the darkest secrets. As the sun set over Maple Hollow Estates, the community began to heal. The HOA board was replaced with transparent, accountable members. The new community center thrived, welcoming families, children, and neighbors alike. Mark, Emily, and Sophie stood together in front of the center, watching children play. Mark whispered to Emily, "We did it. We turned fear into hope." She smiled, squeezing his hand. And this is just the beginning. The camera zoomed out, capturing the laughter, the light, the new life blossoming from the shadows of the past. The end.